Hi, I'm Joseph Ruvens of the Breda University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, and I'm a professor of organizational behavior, especially for students in hospitality management. And this will be a cross-cultural lecture, and we start with another worldview. Now, when you look at this map of the world, most of you may find this odd, because most of you are used to having this map the other way around. And the reason is that the people who made this map, or made the first maps, were from Western Europe. I think it was either the Netherlands or Britain, but they made the map and they put themselves in the center of the world. Just like most nations put themselves in the center of the world. And I think part of the cross-cultural challenges come from that fact. Now, what I will show you first is that there are three perspectives to look at different cultures. And one perspective is quite famous. That's the one we call the day perspective. The day perspective is when we look at another culture as them, you know, the Japanese, the French, and us, the Dutch, the Germans, the Americans. Then you have a perspective called the we perspective. And the we perspective is where you actually make an effort to live like the locals. I can give you an example. I've been a student in the US, in France, in Bologna, and now I am working in the Netherlands, even when I come from Belgium, so from a different culture. But each time when I've been in a culture, I have decided to join the local festivities, the local foods, a lot of the local behavior, and then you enter the we perspective. Now the richness of the we perspective is that you start to see new things, things you didn't see before. For example, in the Netherlands, people have a tendency to be more direct or upfront than people in Belgium. It's changing, but that's what's going on. Now, what did I learn from the Dutch? For example, that when I was sitting in a meeting and I was being quiet, local people consider this almost uninterested. They would prefer me to come up with suggestions. They would also prefer me to say what my truth was. For example, if I disagreed with something, I could just openly disagree with it, rather than the standard Belgian way where you try not to disagree but go around it. So I learned this more direct approach, and what was interesting is I could import this approach also in my relationships with my Belgian friends and relatives. I had to do it maybe more subtly, but I could import directness. And the only way I could have learned directness is by doing it, by living it with the culture. Just like, for example, when I was a student in the United States, I learned that it was okay to fail. It was okay to try out new and weird and different things. And if it didn't work out, people didn't find it a big problem. They said, great, you tried it. It was very different from my culture, at least 1980s Flanders or Belgium, where if something didn't work out, it seemed to be almost like a blame. Now I realize I am giving some stereotypical comments. They may have changed, but the point is, see if you can go into the we perspective rather than the they perspective. Also, the they perspective is very bizarre, because if I say something like the French, what do I mean? Which picture do I have in my head? Do I have this kind of silly picture of a man wearing a beret and holding his baguette under him and drinking wine? Is that my image? Or do I have an image of a young, hardworking female executive in Paris? Or do I have an image of a farmer in the south of France? And even that, it's always about specific people. And the danger with the day perspective is that you start to live in this illusionary world of a whole group being something. They are like this or they are like that, which of course scientifically makes absolutely no sense. There's a day perspective, which most of us do, the we perspective. And then finally, self-reflexivity. And I would say that perspective is similar to the we perspective, a little bit different, but it basically says when you enter a different culture, you have the chance to evaluate your own culture. You can go back home and say, wait a minute, in my country, shops are closed on a Sunday. And you can ask yourself, is that useful? And the answer may be yes. You may say, yes, I'm glad that there is a day of inactivity in my country so that you can sort of ease down and be quiet. Or you could tell yourself, well, it's odd that we close on Sunday because it's a religious day for the Christian community. It's not so for the Jewish community or non-religious communities. So you could say we should just, keep things open. So self-reflexivity is the skill of taking the wealth of another culture and thinking what that means for you. Now, this is for my students. I will give you a link on the video of HSBC Bank and also on the Peace Corps. And there they talk about things that you should and should not do in another culture. For example, in certain cultures, it's impolite to give something to someone with your left hand. You should always use your right hand. Now, those are little things you should know, or you can at least read about in guidebooks about a culture. Now, I've talked a lot about culture, but I haven't defined it really. Now, you could say that it's a set of basic assumptions that offer shared solutions to universal issues that have evolved over time, and they're handed down from one generation to the next. Now, simply put, the human experience is quite similar for everyone in the world. Whether you're born in Syria, in Belgium, in Japan, all of us have dreams and goals. All of us want family relations, want a job, want peace and harmony. Those are all things we want as humans, but we deal with it differently. So a specific issue, universal issue, could be food. Well, for some people, food means, for example, Spain is it's something that you do between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, and it involves a cooked meal with maybe rice, olives, and some meats and drinks with it. And in another culture, for example, the Netherlands, lunch may mean something that you do between 12 and 1:30, and that involves a sandwich with cheese, for example. Another issue could be relationships. In certain cultures, it is only acceptable to have a marriage between people of different sexes. But there are cultures where it's fine for a marriage between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. So it is again a shared solution of a specific group to a universal issue. How do we deal with those universal issues? And most of you may remember Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, and I go into that in another lecture, but I just want to point out that all those needs are human needs. There is no one on earth who does not have those needs when you're human. the way we fill it out, the way, for example, we deal with esteem needs, may be very different in Pakistan than it is, for example, in the Netherlands, where an esteem need could be that you get an individual award and feel extremely proud of an individual award. Whereas in Pakistan, you may only feel proud when the award was for a group. If it was individual, you may even feel a bit embarrassed vis-a-vis the other people. So we all have esteem needs, but how we fill them out may be different, just like all the other needs. And I'm not sure if you've seen the movie. I was born in 1968, so in the 90s I was mesmerized by a movie called The Matrix, and I really invite you to go there. And the essence of The Matrix is that human beings live in some sort of artificial womb, and inside that we have these connections to our brain, and there a virtual world is created. It happened to be New York City in the late 1980s. Well, culture is this virtual world. Culture is not something that is inherited. It's not something that is genetic. We don't start talking a specific language and behaving a specific way because we happen to be born in Amsterdam rather than in Kyoto or in Buenos Aires. No, it's something that you learn, and we forget that it's just that. It's something that you learned and that you may as well unlearn. And by the way, it's also not the truth. It's not because our culture worships a specific God in a specific way that that's normal or regular or correct. It's just what we happen to do. Now, I make a little jump, but here's a wonderful model in how you can analyze a culture. And this can be a national culture, but it can also be a corporate culture. And I call the model, it's like deep sea diving. So if you look at the culture, you have certain things that are visible. And visible are artifacts and behavior. Then there are things that are invisible, and invisible is often the beliefs, the values, the things that people find important. Like we go to the synagogue on Saturday and we say specific prayers in Hebrew. That is something that we do. Underneath that are then assumptions about the world, about why you do that kind of stuff. And in the next clip, I'll explain that more briefly. So let's start with the visible parts of a culture. So these are the artifacts or the behavior. And this could be things like architecture, greeting rituals, business protocol. Business protocol can be, do you give each other a handshake or a hug, or you bow to each other? It can be the degree of formality or familiarity with which you treat people. It can be specific dress codes to indicate, let's say, more important people wear specific suits. Now, you can see that quite clearly in the Christian churches, where the Pope wears more stuff than a cardinal, at least most of the popes, maybe not this one, and more than just regular pastors. Contact, what's the physical and psychological space? And then also, do we have written versus verbal contract? And here's a short example from the hotel or hospitality industry. This is the Westin Palace, Madrid. And as you can see, it's quite an impressive building. Most of us, when we look at this building, we think this is going to be very expensive. This is probably a 4-star, or sorry, a 5-star property, which it is. It has luxury guests. Will Smith was there a few summers ago, by the way. And when you watch this building, it tells you many different things. Like you're probably realizing that you need quite some money to be able to get a room in that building. You probably imagine that you'll be served formally. And when you enter this hotel, you will see that the concierge and other staff members have very beautiful uniforms. Someone opens the door for you. It's very formal, very almost old school, beautiful, decent things. And that creates a specific culture, a specific atmosphere. And that's very different from this. Some of you may remember the Big Brother house. It used to be a game show in the mid-90s where people were put together in a house and they had to do different tasks. And then the audience was watching this and was then voting who could stay in the house and who had to go. And after a while it started to take on almost ridiculous aspects in that people were really being very unpleasant to each other and all these kinds of things. Now, the Big Brother house is also a specific culture. It told you what you could do, what you couldn't do, what was accepted, what was not accepted. So again, that's a visible aspect of culture. Now here we have other visible aspects of culture, but they need a bit of explanation. Every culture has specific heroes, symbols, myths, stories, rituals, and language. Now, of course, this is stereotypical. And one of the good ways to see what important heroes and symbols are for a culture is to watch TV. And first of all, watch some typical films of a specific country. Now again, it's a stereotype, and I know there's differences, but let's take the typical American movie. Typical American movie is boy or girl has a dream. Then this dream is shattered. You know, something very bad happens. And the boy or the girl is very angry, but says, no problem, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to solve this. So they're busy fixing it and they have a lot of difficulties. But along the way, they probably meet another nice boy or girl. In the beginning they fight, but then they become friends and fall in love. And at the end of the movie, of course, the boy or the girl wins. And not only do they win, but they also have a relationship with this other person. Most likely they end up in a big, beautiful house with money and a big car, and everything is fine. That is the typical American dream. Of course, again, there are other types of movie in America, but that's sort of typical hero. You know, go through difficulties and end up somewhere, and it always involves also material success. It's kind of hard for an American hero to end up, you know, just like successful but poor. Now it's different with other cultures. Now again, it's a stereotype, but I've seen some American adaptations of French movies. One typical French movie is Cousin, Cousine, which became Cousins, or Le Dîner de Cons, which I kind of forgot how that was translated into American or in English. But one essential difference with French movies is that in French movies, very often the protagonists are not so good looking, are not always so bright. They may be much more average people. And life seems to also be challenging, but there seems to be less of this, how can I say it, grandeur challenges that somehow America needs to have. You know, a French hero if he combats one person, that's enough. In American movies have to be like 10 and robots and tanks and everything. No, just one. And in the end of a French movie, very often there can also be a happy ending. And the person is then very content living in his small apartment somewhere in a non-major city. And that's also happiness. It doesn't have to be this exaggeration, or at least the French would call it the exaggeration. So each culture, again, has its own myths, symbols, and heroes, just like every corporation or organization. Another way to see this is advertising. Take some time and check advertising from Germany, from Australia, from the US, from wherever, and you will find patterns of what people find important. And this, by the way, is something that Austrian artist Gottfried Helnwein pointed out to me, is that if you look at American advertising, it very often has to do with solving problems by taking medicine or eating food. You feel bad, take a pill. You feel depressed, have a hamburger. So much about food and medicine. He then had a look at Austrian commercials and German commercials, and there it very often had to do with clean. Many more commercials about soaps and products that made everything clean, and doctors telling you how to brush your teeth well. And so the focus in that culture lied more on cleanliness. Now, I spent a year in Italy, and when I watched Italian advertising, I had a sense it was very clownesque, very loud, exaggerated, and also, I have to admit, very often involving either men or women that were very lightly dressed. So that seems to be a focus of a culture. Good, let's move on. And yes, you have the visible aspects, but you also have invisible ones. And those are beliefs. What do people believe is right? Now here's a picture, I think it's 1971, The Hague, the Netherlands. And that was the way that people who were in the late 20s were supposed to be dressed in those days. Not everyone, but the majority was dressed like this, and it was fine. Nowadays, youth is dressed differently. Now people are more used to the tight jeans, and I see people in their 30s with big beards, which I still find a bit odd. But it's not odd, it's just a belief that's the way we now do things. And it also shows our values. In those days, this showed values of freedom, of togetherness, of social contact, and it was a direct response to the much better dressed people of the 1950s with their suits, but it was a response to say, hey, you know, relax, we're social, we're together, we're not so elitist. And so again, assumptions are what people mean, and this is what really drives behavior. Now, these assumptions are often difficult for us as outsiders to detect. And for insiders, it's hard to explain because that's why we do things. I sometimes tell my students that the reason that a culture does something almost always has to do with because that's a successful way of doing things. Let me be concrete. Why do the Dutch and the Scandinavians, why do they dare to say what they really think? Why do they dare to say negative criticism? One of the reasons they dare to say this is because over hundreds and maybe thousands of years, they have learned this behavior, and this behavior was safe. it was probably very safe for a Dutch merchant in the 16th century to bluntly speak his mind to another merchant without being thrown into jail or tortured or whatever. And therefore, he learned or she learned that that was appropriate. They could continue this. And in other cultures, like Belgium, for example, which is, by the way, I'm now here in a studio in Breda. It's only a 15-minute drive from the Belgian border, but Belgians don't necessarily have this tendency to be so upfront. Now, when I look at the history of Belgium, I see a lot of, I'm losing the word, but we were conquered by many nations, by the Spaniards, the French, the Germans, I think the Austrians, and the Dutch. So we had to learn to shut up and do what the others told us, or we would end up in jail or be tortured. So we learned the art of doing our own thing, but not telling others. So again, why do people do what they do? Is because probably that was the safest, smartest behavior. And that's the way people deal with things, but we often forget that, so we cannot necessarily explain it. And that's why a lot of our culture is an internalized worldview. My grandmother, she's 93, is still convinced that the main reason for economic difficulties is that women have jobs. She says in the good old days, meaning, right after the war, women stayed home and took care of kids, men were at jobs, and she then thinks there was no unemployment then, which, by the way, wasn't true. But she has that view, and I've already for 20 years given up trying to explain to her that that's not the case, because it's a view of the world that she has, and she cherishes it very dearly, and she's not even willing to go look at facts there. Good. Now, we looked at the model of Schneider and Barceau before, the diver, and how it's connected to culture and assumptions. I'm now going to walk you through some assumptions of culture. And I borrowed from several authors, Hofstede, Trompenaars, Schneider and Barceau, and others. And I purposely decided not to stick to one model. The reason I did so is because I want you to make your own selection. I don't necessarily think that Hofstede, Trompenaars, whoever, are the rightest approach to looking at culture. It is an approach. It is one view, also colored by their own culture. But anyways, here they go. So, vision on human activity. Now, some cultures, you could say, are more achievement than ascription oriented. And there's always different shades, so don't think about this too much in black and white terms, but you could say that in certain cultures it is more important what you have done than who you are. The difference is, let's take 200 years ago, many people wanted to be part of the aristocracy, and they tried to get into the favor of the king, so that the king would say, from now on you're a baron or an earl or a duke. And they thought, great, I've made it in life, I became a baron. That's ascription. That's wanting to belong to a specific group of people. Whereas nowadays people would say, doesn't matter whether you're born aristocrat or whatever, it's what you do, what you with your own talents are able to achieve. And here's an example of one of our students. She was Student of the Year, but also she received an award by the Jumeirah Carlton hotels of being the best employee of the month. So that shows individual achievement, important for her, important for the hotel and for us. And it's very different from this one. It's a bit of a cartoon saying that, you know, why is somebody a king? Well, just because he or she happens to be born in a specific way without having done anything. And but in certain cultures that's enough, you know. Okay, another one is what we call power distance. And power distance is what you could call is how easy is it for you to gain access to someone who is higher up than you. I'm already using culturally colored words. For example, if your boss lives on the top floor of a 100-story building and he has a huge desk and he has 3 secretaries and it's extremely difficult for you, you know, just a regular clerk to talk to him, most of the time it's a him, then you are living in a high power distance culture. If on the other hand, you are working in a flexible office space, you take your laptop, and let's say you're, you know, 15 years ago, you're at Apple, and you log in with your computer, with your Apple, and hey, by the way, Steve Jobs sits right next to you, and he's doing his work, and he looks at you and he says, oh, you know, Joseph, I'm going to get some coffee. Would you like something? And I say, sure, Steve, bring me a cappuccino. Now, he's the owner of the company. I'm one of the programmers. But it's very easy for me to talk to him directly. That would be a sign of a low power distance culture. And it's important. It's important for students when you go to a different culture to find out what seems to be appropriate here. Is there a lot of hierarchy or not? I personally tell my students when they write me an email, don't call me by my first name. Don't say, Dear Joseph. I mean, I don't get hurt by this, but I just want them to be in the habit of saying, Dear Mr. Ruvens or Dear Professor, because the majority of cultures in this world are still high power distance. If you go to the Middle East, if you go to Latin America, even Germany, right next door, you address your boss by his last name, not by the first name. Except if she or he tells you, you know, you can call me by my first name. So that has to do with power distance. I'm not going to go into it more, but often that's related to hierarchy, who talks to whom. And another short example of what power distance means. Here's a brief. This is an office space where I work. So here you have 3 people that are different in hierarchy. They're all from a different scale, we call it, pay scale and hierarchy scale, but they very openly communicate with each other. The next one. Some of you may have already had some insight into Douglas McGregor's theory X and theory Y. There's also a theory Z, but I'm not discussing it here. Basically, what McGregor says, people can have 2 views on life. If you're in theory X, you basically believe that humans are lazy. And if you don't control them, if you don't tell them what to do, they'll basically be doing nothing. Theory Y has a different approach. There the view is humans are eager. They want to learn. They want to be challenged. So let's find ways to make this flourish more. And by the way, you see this very clearly in the business world. Theory X organizations have a lot of hierarchy, control structures, punch in the clock in the morning. You know, were you there at 8:51 or at 8:53? Very important. Different from a theory Y organization where basically your bosses or the owners of the company say, these are the products we need delivered, and let me help you in achieving those goals. But I'm not going to control you because I know you're a mature human being and are going to do the right thing. So here's an example of our school, a bit of publicity here, the NHTV, Breda University of Applied Sciences. And this is a group of hotel management and facility management students graduating on a change management project and very openly discussing things with each other. And this picture was taken, I think it was about 7 years ago, and all of them are doing quite well. It's also an international group. There is a lady from Colombia and also a man from Germany. The rest, 2 others, are from the Netherlands. Now, okay, that was theory X and theory Y. But task-oriented and relationship-oriented. It's interesting to notice that when I came to work in the Netherlands, almost at every situation, when I came for a job interview or doing a task with somebody, when it was a new person, on average, the person spent less than 5 minutes asking me personal questions. For example, and the questions would be, how was the drive? Did you easily find this place? Would you like a cup of coffee? And that's it. They didn't ask me, are you married? How's life in Belgium? What do you think about our building and the decorations and the history of our nations? No. Less than 5 minutes relationship, and then directly, we want you to do this and this and this for us. Can you do it? And after half an hour, we've arranged our task, and the meeting is over, and we go and do something else. Those are task-oriented cultures. Relationship-oriented cultures are different. For example, typically, when you want to start business relations with the Chinese, you spend a lot of time in the beginning getting to know each other. And by the way, every summer I spend about 10 days with Chinese, Russian, Polish, and German students in Germany, in Bremerhaven. And with my Chinese students, I spend a lot of social time. They treat me beers, and they want to know why I teach in a specific way, and why I speak French, and how's life in Belgium, and how's the food. And this is all part of the fact that for them, for their culture, it's important to know, who is this person? Is this someone we like? Is this someone we can trust? Is this someone we want to be with? And once that is established, then it's fine to go and talk about tasks, but not before. So again, it's very important for task-oriented people, when you go to a relationship-oriented culture, please learn to spend at least a few hours, or find out how many hours or days you need to do non-task-oriented stuff to be accepted by those people. And of course, the reverse also holds. Another way of defining cultures, and I'm going over it quickly, so I really invite you to read specifically about the culture and the country you're going to. Difference between a tough and a tender culture. And the basic idea is, well, in tough, or sometimes they also call it masculine cultures, it's all about work, it's all about achievement. And the cliche could be, in a tough culture, you live in order to work, and in a tender culture, you work in order to live. So those are some essential differences. And yes, I want to leave it at that. And maybe here's a typical one. What's his name again? This chef. I don't mind, it doesn't matter. But anyways, I remember him screaming and using the F word a lot in kitchens and making everybody nervous. I didn't like the program, but that was very tough oriented. I kind of prefer tender cultures where people say, hey, let's sit together, cook a bit. If it doesn't work, we'll try it again. You know, just take it easy, dolce vita, enjoy life. Then there is a difference between what you could call, in the way you relate to other people, what is called universal or particular. Typical example. In our school, if someone cheats on the exam, it doesn't matter who he or she is. I mean, this person can be the king or the prince of the Netherlands, so to speak, but if he cheats on the exam, he gets a fail and may even be excluded from school. The rules apply to everybody. But there are some cultures or regions in the world where people say, wait a minute, there's a very different rules for us than for other people. And it can be religion. It can be, if you're part of our religion, you have a lot of freedom. If you're a member of the other religions, you have to pay more taxes, or there are certain things you cannot do. It can be ethnicity. And one of the worst examples, of course, is the apartheid regimes, whether it was in South Africa or in America, where you say, hey, if you happen to be Caucasian, white, there's all these things you can do. If you're not, there's other rules that apply to you. Now, the world is tending to go to more universalism, but there are still many cultures where particularism is playing. Doing versus being culture. Now, I find this a difficult one to explain. Basically because I'm a member of a doing culture. You could say most of Western Europe are cultures where people say, let's do something, let's take action. Sure, you can think about making a decision, but if you say, I'm going to think 5 months about something, most people would say, you're just scared of taking initiative. But there are cultures, the more being cultures, where life seems to be less pressing, where people find it okay to think a lot more about what they think should be done, or where life almost seems to be moving slower. Now, both of these cultures have advantages and disadvantages. For example, and I'll be very personal, Belgium is partly a doing culture. Now, if I look back over the last 15 years that I've been living in the city of Antwerp or outside the city of Antwerp, I've seen people continuously reshaping our roads. And it's always the same story. We are reshaping the road because we want traffic to be more efficient. We are reshaping the tram lines because we want traffic to be more efficient. But the reality is, for the last 10, 15 years, there's always been traffic jams and traffic difficulties because somebody feels we need to do something to make it go more efficiently. Maybe we should stop doing that, and then traffic can just run, which eventually it does. That is what some being cultures do. Some being cultures say, well, we used to travel in our city without a bridge, and it worked rather fine. So whether we should have or not have a bridge is something we should really, really very deeply think about before we take an initiative, because if we make the wrong decision, we have to change it all the time. And I think that's one of the essential difficulties of the doing culture. Of course, a being culture can then be a culture where you're so stuck into the way we always done something that you almost become You almost think that any innovation is necessarily something bad. Now, good. This was introduction to cross-cultural understanding, especially for second-year university students. I hope you enjoyed it. And for those at NHTV, these are our tutors working with you. Please come and find us, and we'll be very happy to help you.